I'd like to now introduce the next speakers. So you've heard that the toolkit is composed of several different tools, and it's been developed as this collaborative effort with several different organizations. So we brought a lot of different expertise to each of the different tools. So firstly, Yannick Lucas, who is a project officer at UNEP CCC, will present on the general and portfolio tools. Erin Danford, who is a consultant at Perspectives Climate Group, will present on the carbon market tool. And then Francois Samut, who is the director of carbon limits, will present on the investment tool. So I'll first hand over the floor to you, Yannick.
Thanks a lot, Hannah. I hope you can all see my screen. Hello, everyone. So I want to take you through the option of a portfolio assessment and the general interventions tool, highlighting their specificities, but also what all tools have in common. So first, let us start at the end of the process, looking at what kind of results the toolkit will help produce. For this, I want to briefly come back to this overview we've seen earlier. The toolkit supports the user in generating a lot of detailed information across all of these dimensions. However, let's rearrange this picture a little bit. For each intervention, the toolkit also helps to condense the expected transformational impact into a single picture. This one. After every assessment, the expected outcomes and the processes that facilitate a comprehensive transformation receive an aggregated score. And that way, the result can be easily and intuitively visualized by placing it as a dot in this matrix or heat map. This should not take away from the underlying complexity and nuances of the intervention, which will be always part of the assessment reports. However, this graph makes interventions easier to compare and conveys their transformational potential at a glance. If we zoom out to see the outputs from the toolkit and how the different tools relate to one another. So the carbon market, investment, and general tool are used to assess individual interventions one by one. They all produce a report that shows the detailed and aggregated assessment of the different dimensions of transformational change that we've just seen. These individual assessments you can then put together to a portfolio, allowing you to look at them in conjunction, make comprehensive comparisons, and evaluate the set of activities more comprehensively. To help you decide at the beginning which of the tools best fits your needs, we put together these 3 guiding questions. But since you will hear much more about this from both my colleagues and me in the next few minutes, I will gloss over this one for now. Just know that it's always accessible in the toolkit online whenever you need it. So let's dive into the general interventions tool and, importantly, what it has in common with the carbon market and investment tools. The general tool serves as a kind of umbrella, which can be used for any type of intervention, really. The most common use case will likely be for government policies or projects for which the financial component is not as important. The structure is largely the same, but you find additional features specific to carbon markets and investment decisions in the other tools. These 4 components you see on the right, however, are present in all 3 of them. So let's start with the scope of the assessment. To provide context and transparency, the first user inputs will capture the boundaries of the assessment, whether the intervention is assessed retrospectively or in advance, which sectors and regions are covered, how far we want to look into the future, and finally, how stakeholders will be involved in the assessment process. After that, we want to make sure that there's an explicit understanding of what the system transformation consists of. What does it look like? How is it expected to develop, also in relation to the different stages of transformational change that we've seen earlier? And importantly, where does this particular intervention fit into this process? In addition to this transformational vision, as it's called in the methodology, we look at what factors could inhibit this and how our intervention relates to or even directly tackles these barriers to transformational change within that system. In the actual assessment, for all characteristics that are seen as relevant for the intervention, the user assigns a score. This usually takes the form of, as we've talked about, a qualitative evaluation on a predefined scale, assessing the direction and degree or the estimated likelihood of an impact. This is done for all process characteristics, as well as mitigation, adaptation, and effects on selected sustainable development goals. To ensure transparency and increase the usefulness for working on these assessments also in teams, the user is asked to provide a brief justification for all inputs, with the option to also add background documents that support the respective assessment. Finally, after completing the previous steps, the results are immediately accessible within the toolkit. To make sharing easier, as Boudica outlined earlier, a standardized PDF report can be generated just with one click. Both of these contain the results, including justifications and background, but also show the overall impact in a very simple way by locating the intervention on the familiar grid or heat map. Moving on to the portfolio tool. The purpose of this is to perform an assessment of the transformational impact of multiple interventions. For example, a set of different policies as part of nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. The individual assessments that are pulled together can be performed with any of the three tools: general, carbon market, or investment. In addition to allowing for an easy side-by-side comparison, the portfolio tool also supports an aggregated view of all the greenhouse gas emissions that the set of interventions is expected to mitigate, and it helps you see how well they align with the priorities across all sustainable development goals within your country. Let's have a look at how this works. To show the alignment of interventions with the sustainable development priorities, we first need to establish what those are. I think we will likely all agree that all of the 17 sustainable development goals are important. However, some countries will put different emphasis on different goals. One way to go about it is to base it on the progress that has already been made towards achieving the targets of a certain SDG. If there's a lot more effort required, for example, it could make sense to assign a high priority. Using this categorization into high, medium, and low priorities for the Sustainable Development Goals, the portfolio tool matches this to the impacts on these SDGs from the individual outcome assessments. Remember, an intervention can be assessed to have both negative and positive effects on selected SDGs, and they can vary in degrees from major to relatively minor impacts. In the resulting overview, we use green and red colors to illustrate the alignment in an easy way. Strong impacts on highly prioritized SDGs are shown with the darker shades, and minor impacts on low priority goals in lighter shades. Let's have a look at an example. Here we see the impact of some intervention on a subset of 6 SDGs, ranging from minor to major, both positive and negative effects. Combined with the priorities from high to low that were assigned, we get this color-coded overview of how the impacts compare when taking the alignment with the country priorities into account. In the portfolio then, we of course see this alignment for all included interventions. While this cannot give ultimate clarity on which policies or projects should be pursued or abandoned, we can quickly identify potential problems or components of a particular intervention that we should take another more in-depth look at. Using this information can help the user to revise and refine their respective portfolio. Moving on to the aggregation of greenhouse gas emission reductions across the portfolio. While climate mitigation is just one of the outcome categories, greenhouse gas emission reductions are generally easier to quantify than, for example, contributions to climate adaptation or gender equality. So in addition to comparing the qualitative assessments of potentially transformational outcomes, the portfolio tool also provides a summary of annual emission reductions expected from all interventions. This does not replace an in-depth evaluation or modeling of emission reduction pathways, but it gives a first estimate and supports the comparison of multiple options contained in the portfolio. At the end, the report for the portfolio assessment follows the same logic as the ones for the other tools. It can be explored online or in a document and gives easily understandable summaries as well as the assessment details. In addition to what we have for the individual tools, the portfolio report provides a straightforward side-by-side comparison across the various process and outcome characteristics. It includes graphs that show which sectors and SDGs are most represented in the portfolio, and of course, a transformational change matrix, our heat map, that includes more than just one dot to give you the complete picture. And that's it from me. Thanks a lot, and over to you, Erin, for more details on the carbon market tool.
Great, thank you, Yannick. I'll just wait a moment for the slides. Yes, hi everyone, thank you. My name is Erin Danford. I'm a consultant and carbon markets expert with Perspectives Climate Group, and I'll take you quickly through the carbon markets tool. So basic characteristics of the carbon market tool. We have, of course, the same goal as the other tools, which is to promote NDC target achievement and ambition raising towards net zero pathways, and of course, to promote sustainable development at the same time. The target users for the carbon market tool would be carbon market project and program developers. So that could be governments, financial institutions, private sector actors, and the tool is designed to be used for baseline and crediting systems. So that includes both Article 6 and the voluntary carbon market. You have the option at the beginning of the tool to select which crediting standard you're using. The purpose of the tool is to allow both a self-assessment of an intervention's transformative impacts, so just to be used for your own use, or also to enable reporting on those impacts. For example, you could do an ex-ante assessment to attract potential buyers with the transformational potential of your program. We needed a separate carbon markets tool because there are unique criteria that underpin transformative carbon market interventions, which wouldn't otherwise be covered in a general tool. So for example, the allocation of a share of mitigation outcomes to the host country, or decreasing baseline emission coefficients over time. The tool can be used on its own or in combination with any of the other tools. So for example, as one component of the portfolio tool, or if there's a particularly strong aspect of private investment in the carbon program, then you could also use the investment tool for that portion. As far as the structure of the carbon markets tool, we tried to keep the same basic structure and categories and indicators as the other tools to make it as user-friendly as possible. So we have in the beginning the assessment information with also some questions specific to carbon markets. So for example, with methodologies are being used or which crediting standard. Then we have a section which is bespoke to the carbon markets tool, which is an environmental and social integrity preconditions section, and I'll explain that in a moment. Then we have, of course, the transformational change criteria, which is aligned with the other tools, and the results. And the results are also formatted in the same way so that you can compare the score of a carbon markets intervention to also a private investments intervention, for example. And another major change that we've made based on previous work on transformational change is also including adaptation as an additional feature with great assistance from UNEP-CCC there. So as I mentioned, we need a separate carbon markets tool because there are aspects of carbon markets which are really unique and can't be forgotten when we're looking at transformational change. And a major part of that is environmental and social integrity. So we decided to create an environmental and social integrity preconditions section of the tool because the debate on integrity in carbon markets is only growing stronger. And there are a set of minimum preconditions that need to be considered before an activity can be considered transformational. So for example, if you have an activity which has very strong sustainable development benefits or a very large greenhouse gas mitigation outcome, but the activity is not truly additional, then we would argue that that isn't actually a transformational activity. So in our tool, all applicable preconditions need to be met before you'll get a score to be transformational. We have three main pillars here. That would be safeguards for environmental integrity. So these are the basic safeguards like different forms of additionality, NDC alignment, robust quantification of mitigation outcomes. Then we have prevention of GHG emissions lock-in. So for example, that the intervention doesn't appear on a negative list and is also aligned with long-term low emission development strategies. And then of course, the basic prevention and avoidance of negative environmental and social impacts. This takes us then to the transformational change section, which is really the meat of the tool. And here we have the same processes and outcomes as the other tools, but we have specific guiding questions that are specific to carbon markets. So under technology change, we focus on new and emerging technologies, high abatement costs, upscaling, barriers to adoption, digitalized MRV. Then we have agents of change, such as promoting green entrepreneurship, low carbon coalitions, etc. It's incentives for change, such as a share of mitigation outcomes being allocated to the host country, limiting the crediting period, reducing the baseline emissions factor, and so on. And then we have norms and behavioral change, such as awareness raising, policies for low carbon practices, normalizing desirable practices. Then we have the same outcomes as the other tools, for example, greenhouse gas outcomes, SDG outcomes, and as I mentioned, we've also added adaptation co-benefits because we see this also as a major component of transformational change. One of the main lessons that I think we learned when developing the tool was how to strike a balance between having a robust tool, which gives you a result which is really useful, but also a tool that is user-friendly and relies on data which is reasonably attainable. So in the end, we struck a balance, I think, between developing something that is robust but still user-friendly. We had a case study with our colleagues in Vietnam, which they'll speak more about, but this really assisted us in identifying areas where the tool could be consolidated, but also where additional explanation was necessary, where resources were necessary, or for example, where we could autofill data for you so that it's perhaps a bit less work. So we have a couple of changes to make this tool as flexible as possible. The intervention outcomes such as GHG, SDG, and adaptation impacts in all of the tools they only require qualitative answers. But because this data is available for carbon market interventions, you would have greenhouse gas emissions data, you would have the SDG impacts. We also allow quantitative assessment. So we provide guidance on how you can calculate quantitative impacts if you want to show a more robust assessment, for example, to a potential buyer. We also give the option to upload documents if you would like to provide evidence. So here you're flexible in doing your own assessment where you just input your data, look at the score, and maybe this helps you change your activity, design it in a more transformational way. Or you can decide to do a really quantitative assessment, include all of the evidence, and then have this PDF report which you can circulate to really show the transformational impact of your activity. So I hope you all use the tool and find also that you've struck a balance here that's useful, but also user-friendly for you. Thank you.
Thanks, Erin. We'll just invite Francois now to present on the investment tool.
I will do. Okay, thank you very much, Hannah. So I will give you a quick overview to the investment tool, but just to highlight that a lot of the aspects of the other tools that were presented by Yannick and Erin beforehand are relevant to the investment tool, so I don't want to duplicate certain aspects. So I will really just focus on how the investment tool is to be used and how it was developed and what kind of questions are behind it. How does it manage to calculate the transformational change score at the end of the assessment. So if we go to the next one. So what are the characteristics of the investment tool and what is the approach that we took? So the objectives of the tool, and very specifically for the investment tool, is to assess the transformational impact of discrete, so single activities which are funded at least partially from the private sector through different types of funds. Could be loans, could be equity funding, could be a whole list of different types of funding, but it's not the type of project that it just comes from the public budget. So there has to be a component of private funding. And the target group then is the private sector project developers, investment funds, international financial institutional and multinational development banks, and allows them to assess the expected or if it's ex post assessment, the achieved transformational impact of a single investment or a single project or a small portfolio of investment projects. And this is the types, again, a list of the types of investment and investment vehicles that can be reviewed, or the investments that are at the base of the projects. And the types of investments could be government, private sector, IFIs, and others, as long as there is this private sector component to the investment. The approach is based on the ICAT TC methodology and follows quite closely the stepwise approach that are described in the methodology in the specific sections 5 to 11, which Karen described. And what we'll look at is how the assessment of the impact on process characteristics and the outcomes, how they are assessed by the user in order to provide a score of transformational impact. As Erin also highlighted, with the carbon market tool, this tool can also be used in combination with the other tools where relevant, or it can be used on its own. But what's also important is to differentiate, in particular, the investment tool from the carbon markets tool, and in a way where not to use the investment tool. So it's important that the investment tool is really used where there isn't any access, let's say, to carbon markets. So any type of project that will not lead to a transaction of mitigation outcomes or other types of emission reductions that are covered by a particular carbon market. In that case, obviously, the carbon market tool can be used. Okay, so you've seen this a few times now, but just to highlight to you what are the process characteristics and outcomes. So the process characteristics, there are in total 12 of them. And what we've done in the next slide is to undertake then the assessment of the process characteristics. So as I mentioned, there are 12 process characteristics, and for each one, the user of the tool is provided with a guiding question or guiding questions, which will allow them to provide a likelihood score for each characteristic. So what is the transformational impact or a score, as it were, for that specific process characteristic. There's a number of guiding questions for each process characteristic, and these guiding questions can be 2 guiding questions up to 6 guiding questions. And for example, if we use the research and development process characteristic, then the type of question is straightforward. Does it have a local R&D component? And then explaining that kind of question, what is meant by that. Is there a collaboration with local engineers, local scientists, other institutions? Does the intervention have significant training components? So again, explaining that question in more detail. Is there an investment in technical training? Is there capacity building? Is there an educational program related to this intervention? And in addition to these questions and the explanation, there are also examples. So when you hover the mouse over the question, it gives you an example of what we could mean by this collaboration with local engineers or collaboration with scientists. So trying to make it as accessible as possible, make the guiding questions as clear as possible by providing this explanation and providing these examples. The user should be able to understand what the question is about and how it relates to their project. And the examples and the questions are very much linked to the transformational change methodologies, the methodology and the references that are used and at the basis of this methodology. So a lot of these questions are relate or mirror the transformational change methodology, which Karen explained. And there, in total, then we have 48 questions. As I said, each of these 12 process characteristics has 2 to 6 questions. And in total, there are 48 guiding questions. So based on these questions, there is quite a range of questions. It gives a good assessment of the impact, the transformational impact with respect to process characteristics due to this quite range of questions, range of guiding questions, which the user has to answer. Okay, next one. And then for the assessment of outcomes, the approach is slightly more quantitative. So the user is asked to score the transformational impact of the activity based on the volume of emission reductions as a percentage of global emissions or national or sector level emissions. And also, what is the sustained nature of the outcome? What is the duration of the intervention, 15 years, 5 to 15 years, and so on. And again, based on these aspects, this provides a score of the outcomes related to this intervention. And for the assessment of the outcomes, SDGs and outcomes adaptation, the same approach as the portfolio has been adopted. And as Yannick made an excellent presentation on how that is done, then again, in order to have some consistency between the tools, we have adopted as well the same approach. And the same approach with respect to adaptation, as Erin mentioned, that's also part of the carbon market tools and the other tools. This is also the same approach has been taken. So there is consistency. So there is overall consistency where possible between the different tools, but obviously the different need to reflect the audience and the users that are going to use the tool.